On May 8, 1945, in a muddy holding camp near Bad Kreuznach, Germany, the war ended but silence did not follow. Behind barbed wire, hundreds of German women sat huddled in woolen coats, faces drawn from exhaustion and fear. These were not soldiers. They were volunteers, helpers, stenographers captured by American forces and branded prisoners of war. The air smelled of wet earth and metal. Rain tapped gently against the corrugated roofs of makeshift barracks. Outside, American guards paced with cold stares, their rifles slung low. Inside, whispers carried stories of families lost, cities in ruins, futures vanished. Then came the food. Sloshed onto tin trays, it steamed under grey skies, lumpy mashed potatoes, oily spam, creamed corn from bulging cans. Someone muttered, "Das ist Tierfutter." That's animal feed. Laughter broke through the tension, bitter and hollow. Yet, beneath the mocking, a seed of doubt stirred. They were starving and supper had arrived from the enemy. The first to taste it was Lotte, a 19-year-old prisoner with frost-bitten fingers and a permanent tremor in her hands. She scraped the edge of the spam with a spoon that rattled against her tray, her lips pressed thin, resisting. But hunger triumphed over pride. The smell was foreign, salty, canned, industrial, but the warmth it carried kissed her through the cold. She chewed slowly, primally, expecting revulsion. Instead, it was tolerable. Better than moldy potato peels, better than nothing at all. Others watched from their bunks, curiosity flickering beneath suspicion. A ripple spread. Another woman took a bite, then another. The irony wasn't lost on them. Fed by the enemy, eating what they mocked, yet none spit it out. This food, strange and lowly, did not kill them. It fed them. In a world that had collapsed, the enemy gave them supper, and a strange shame settled in with the taste. That night, lying on rust-stained cots beneath thin army-issue blankets, the women didn't speak of the war. They whispered instead of the food. "It reminds me of winters before the war," one said. "Fat on the tongue, real fat." Another swore she could taste butter, though it was probably powdered. Some cried quietly, not for what they had lost, but for what their bodies remembered. Not just taste, but safety, warmth, home. The irony burned deeper in the moonlight. The women had been raised on images of bold German supremacy, of invincible armies, and righteous conquest. And yet here they were, clinging to life because their captors fed them, because the swill they had scoffed at now sat warm in their bellies. Even those who hated the Americans with every breath swallowed that food. As sleep came, uneasy and fitful, no one knew what came next. But that night, they did not go to bed hungry. And that changed something. 3 mornings later, the routine broke. A low rumble echoed across the camp as a convoy of American supply trucks rolled through the gates. The women tensed, clutching at their threadbare coats. Guards barked orders, but their voices lacked hostility, just tired rhythm. From the back of the trucks came crates, stacked high and marked with block black letters, U.S. Army Rations. One soldier, young and freckled, jumped down and began handing out boxes with a nervous smile. The women didn't move at first. Then Lotte, again, approached. The soldier handed her a box. She hesitated, then took it. Inside, powdered eggs, hard biscuits, a tin of peaches suspended in syrup so sweet it stung the throat. She squinted at the label, confused by the handwriting she couldn't decipher. But it didn't matter. Her fingers dug into the fruit without ceremony. The syrup slid down her cracked lips. Around her, silence gave way to the sound of chewing and low sobs. Hunger was no longer a weapon. It was a bridge. And that morning, for the first time, they said, "Thank you," in unsteady English. Days passed in a grey march of routine. Wake, line up, eat, wait. But beneath this rhythm, something shifted. The prisoners no longer scorned the meals. Some began trading bits of biscuit for spoonfuls of peanut butter, hoarding fruit tins like treasure. A few started watching the guards not with daggers in their eyes, but curiosity. Who were these boys? They were young, too. One soldier, Private Harris, began whistling when he walked past the women, an old jazz tune from New Orleans. At first they turned away. Then one morning, a woman named Marta hummed, just a note, just once. He noticed and nodded. The moment passed, too small to register as history, but it was there, a breath of something different, something dangerous in its softness. For the women, shame turned into reflection. Not pride, not forgiveness, but a quiet reckoning. They had been prepared to suffer. They weren't prepared to be fed. They weren't prepared for kindness. That evening, as darkness swallowed the camp and a pale moon hung low, the women gathered in small circles like embers against the cold. The food had become more than sustenance. It was a reluctant thread, stitching them to something they didn't understand. Marta held a tin of peanut butter in her lap with reverence, her fingers sticky and trembling. Beside her, another woman recited an old poem she half remembered, her voice cracked but steady. Across the yard, Private Harris leaned against the fence, watching silently, his rifle untouched. In that moment, there were no speeches, no forgiveness, no friendship, only proximity. The women were still prisoners, the guards still captors. But something ineffable had passed between them. A kindness not rooted in politics or pity, just in the unspoken truth that all of them were human, hungry and tired. And for now, that was enough. A strange peace grew in that void where hate once lived. But the spell did not last. 1 week later, on a sunless afternoon, the commandant arrived, his jeep kicking up dust as it growled into the yard. An American officer stepped out, clean-shaven, clipboard in hand, flanked by military police. His tone was clipped, urgent. The women were to be transported. Where? He did not say. The murmur spread like smoke. Faces paled. Marta clutched the peanut butter tin to her chest. Lotte stood frozen, her legs numb before she moved. The trucks were lined up again, only this time. There were no crates of rations, just benches, just soldiers with distant eyes. As the women were loaded inside, the fragile thread of peace that had begun to weave through the camp threatened to unravel. Were they being sent to labor camps? Repatriation? No one knew. The same guards who once handed out peaches now averted their gaze. No more music, just wheels in gravel, groaning toward uncertain roads. The silence returned, heavier this time, because now the women knew the taste of human mercy, and feared they'd never taste it again. The journey was slow and jarring. The trucks clawed their way over cratered roads, each pothole a punishing reminder that the war had ended in name but not in consequence. Faces pressed to the canvas flaps, searching the passing scenery for clues. Burnt-out villages blurred by, crops trampled, smoke still rising from somewhere. A woman asked for water and was told to wait. Another clutched a photograph torn during capture, the edges rubbed soft. They drove for hours, destination cloaked in silence. Finally, near a pine forest that stood eerily intact, the convoy stopped. A different camp, barbed wire, wooden gates, guards less familiar. But something unfolded that none expected. As the women were led down from the trucks, a familiar scent rode the air bread, warm and fresh. Not army rations, not cans, real bread. Handed out by Red Cross workers with firm but gentle eyes. A murmured word passed between the women. Civilization, civilization, what they had lost, what they hoped might return, and in that small grace, another thread was sewn frail, yet stubborn, a taste lingering at the edge of memory, refusing to fade. Inside the new camp, things were different but not simple. The women were still POWs, still under watch, but the atmosphere was thinner, less suffocating. Red Cross volunteers moved between barracks, offering medical checks and distributing clothes that smelled of soap instead of mildew. A Swiss nurse named Elise, her accent soft and lilting, worked tirelessly among them. When she touched Lotte's shoulder to examine her frostbite, the girl flinched not from pain, but from unfamiliar tenderness. Meals came on real plates now, still meager, still rationed, but served with unhurried hands. Tea was sometimes hot. The food no longer carried an edge of survival, but something closer to dignity. And for the first time since their capture, the women were asked politely about their health, their families, their names. That name spoken aloud by another, written on a clipboard, felt like a secret unlocked. They were not forgiven. They were not redeemed. But in the faint steam of tea and the soft fabric of clean cotton, they were something else. People again. But memory clung to them like soot. Even as routines steadied and meals took on a rhythm, the past interrupted, sharp and unruly. One morning, a crate of American comic books was mistakenly delivered alongside medical supplies. The covers were loud with color, cartoons in flight, smiling boys in uniforms defeating evil. Marta picked one up, flipping through with stiff fingers. "They smile as if they've never seen ruin," she whispered. Lotte lay nearby, tracing the edge of her blanket, eyes half-lidded. "Maybe that's why they won," she said. "They believed in a better ending." Around them, the women fell silent, some reading, some remembering. A few laughed nervously, not unkindly. The war had ended. Hunger was no longer the loudest voice, yet grief persisted, sneaking into corners, seeping from old scars. Still, something vital had changed. From cans of Spam to soft-spoken nurses, the unexpected kindness of an enemy had formed a mirror, and slowly, painfully, the women began to look into it without looking away. It was Lotte who first allowed herself to speak the unspoken. Sitting in the weak sun near the camp fence, she turned to Marta with a steady gaze and said, "They fed us like people." Just 4 words. Simple. Dangerous. Marta replied only with a nod, the tin of peanut butter still hidden beneath her bunk at night like a relic. Around them, the others began to write letters, some to families they weren't sure still existed, others to no one at all, just ink poured onto page for the sake of remembering. They wrote about food, strangely often. The canned peaches, the warmth, the absurd mercy. But they also wrote of silence, of guilt, of everything too heavy to carry alone. Weeks later, after repatriation began, and the women were released one group at a time, they stepped beyond the camp's gates, thin but upright. Lotte looked back once, not to mourn, but to mark. Behind her was captivity and cruelty, but also a tin tray, a shared peach, a freckled boy with a nervous smile. In war, mercy is the most dangerous act, because it outlasts everything, even hate. Decades later, in a quiet kitchen in Bonn, Lotte stood at her counter, opening a can of peaches. The hiss of the lid pierced the silence, and for a moment, she wasn't an old woman arthritic and slow, but a girl again, cold and afraid, chewing sweetness against despair. Her granddaughter watched, curious. "Is it special?" she asked. Lotte smiled faintly, placed a slice on a saucer, and nodded. "Yes," she said. "It fed me when nothing else could." The girl did not understand, not fully, but she listened, because within that fruit lay a history not written in books. A war that ended with bombs, but also with bread, with laughter through grit teeth, with food that healed more than hunger. Lotte didn't speak often of the camps or the shame or the kindness from those she'd been taught to fear. But in that moment, she passed it on in syrup, not silence. And though the war was long over, its taste lingered, quiet and unyielding, like memory softened by time. In a museum corner decades later, behind a glass case etched with dates and faces fading into sepia, sat a single rusted food tray. Nearby, an aged label read, "Issued to German POWs 1945, donated by former internee L. Weiss. Visitors passed without pause, eyes caught elsewhere on medals, on maps, on uniforms with WWII creases. But the tray remained, quiet, unassuming. One child asked her father, "Why is food in a war exhibit?" He paused, looked at the tray. "Because sometimes," he answered slowly, "what you feed someone in defeat says more than how you fight them." He didn't know the women's names, didn't know about syrup on cracked lips or peanut butter clutched in silence, but history held that tray for a reason, not as proof of a meal but of mercy. Mercy served not to the innocent or the heroic but to the broken, to the hated, to prisoners, food that spoke when words failed. And in that silence, the war ended once more, quietly, for those still listening. Yet even now, among archives and stones, the echoes refuse burial. Survivors speak less often now, their voices thin with age but unwavering. Among them, a taped interview from 1987 emerges, brittle in sound yet sharp in memory. Lotte, her voice low, cracked by time, recalls a moment during captivity. "We did not eat like friends," she says, "but neither like enemies." The interviewer presses her, asks what she means. Her pause stretches long, then ends with a truth carved into silence. Hunger made us honest. That tape, tucked into a library shelf rarely visited, waits. And in that wait lives the strange permanence of small things of what fed them not just with calories, but with contradiction. A kindness undeserved, a gesture never forgotten, not sugar-coated, not revised, only remembered. Because food, when given without demand, without jeer, slips past the teeth and into the soul, it lingers. And somewhere between defeat and dignity, it still whispers, "You mattered, even then." In the end, history records battles, treaties, dates etched in stone. But what it often forgets are the quiet transactions of grace that unfold in the margins. A spoonful of spam, a snapshot of fruit in syrup, a trembling hand accepting what pride first denied. The German women held in those camps were never thanked for their silence, nor asked for forgiveness. Yet their stories, unearthed decades later in diaries, letters, and museum donations, show the fragile borders where humanity insisted on surviving. They did not forget what they endured, but neither did they forget the moments that complicated the narrative, that cracked the clarity of black and white with shades of bittersweet grey. War is loud, brutal, final, but peace, real peace, is built in whispers, over meals shared across lines drawn in blood, in kindness extended to those who did not earn it, and in the stubborn memory of those who, for one strange moment, tasted mercy on the edge of surrender. Somewhere in the archives of a Red Cross ledger, faded ink marks a curious detail, a sharp increase in peach tin distributions to POW camps during the summer of 1945. No commentary, no explanation, just numbers. No one documented what those tins meant to the mouths they reached. No one recorded the way sugar soothed fractured spirits or how peanut butter became more than protein, became protection. But the women remembered, their descendants remembered. In attics across Germany, rusted can openers rest beside yellowing letters that begin, "I never thought this would mean something one day." And it did. Not as redemption, not as erasure, but as truth. The kind that doesn't shout or wave flags. The kind that sneaks in through broken windows, rests on trembling tongues, and stays. That taste, that insult turned lifeline, that animal feed, which proved to be more human than hate. In war's debris, it is sometimes the smallest mercy that endures the longest. Years later, tucked away in a shoebox beneath Marta's bed, a brittle slip of paper held one final testimony. A camp menu for the week of June 12, 1945. Stained with oil, faded with time, it listed meals, No royal court would envy powdered mash, dried fruit, cold beans, condensed milk. But in the margin, written in pencil so faint it nearly vanished, were 3 words: Es hat geholfen. It helped. Marta had written it in a moment, no one witnessed, and no history book would cite. But that paper, curling with age, remains. Because wars are won with weapons, but survived with something else. A warm spoon, a soft word, a hand that feeds instead of strikes. And when the last guns fall silent and uniforms hang limp in closets, it is not victory or vengeance men and women remember most. It is that first bite, that unexpected mercy, that stubborn proof that even in ruins humanity refuses to starve. So, the spoon remains figuratively and literally a relic not of nutrition or necessity, but of the unrecorded spaces in war where survival met unexpected dignity. In exhibits, in family trunks, in brittle recollections translated to trembling English, the women's memories flow toward a single, inarguable truth. It mattered, the way they were fed, who fed them, what it tasted like. Beneath the horror, beneath allegiance and atrocity, lay that primal exchange, mouth to hand, hunger to mercy. Not all their captors were kind, and not every meal was a turning point, but some were, enough to leave echoes. And as Lotte once whispered to her granddaughter while slicing peaches into warm oatmeal, sometimes the enemy lets you live, but sometimes they remind you you're alive. That was the lasting wound and the lasting grace. Not carved into monuments, but cradled in modest acts, a tray, a peach, a spoonful swallowed in silence, and in that silence, history still breathes. In the quiet spaces where no flags fly and no anthems play, the aftershocks of war continue to settle, not just in treaties or ruins, but in the unseen generosity that once passed between enemies. A tray of unfamiliar food in a forgotten camp, a sullen girl whose hunger softened into gratitude, the slow, aching realization that mercy can arrive unearned and unwelcome, and still change everything. These are not grand gestures, they are not histories taught in school or scripted into films, but they are the pivots of real humanity. And though the camps have long been emptied and the rations consumed or discarded, memory remembers differently. It remembers taste, it remembers shame, and most of all, it remembers that even when nations clashed and ideologies tore at flesh and soil, one truth held firm: to feed someone is to see them. And once seen, even a prisoner cannot be unseen again. That is how peace begins, quietly, at a table, with a spoon. In an old city cafe near Frankfurt, velvet curtains pulled against the autumn chill, a historian gives a lecture to a room of quiet listeners. Her topic: unconventional acts of mercy during World War II. On the podium beside her rests one item scratched, dented, unmistakable. A US Army ration can. She lifts it without flourish. This fed prisoners, she says softly. Not just German women, but the memory of them. A pause. The audience leans forward. It embarrassed them, sustained them, changed them. Behind her, a grainy image flickers onto the screen: women in threadbare coats, their expressions unreadable, their trays half full. No script could capture what lived behind those eyes. The humbling of certainty, the touch of the unexpected. The historian does not close with triumph or apology. She merely sets down the can, gently, and says, "Sometimes, mercy is anonymous, but its consequences never are. Outside, people pass unaware, but inside, something lingers, a taste between silence and survival. A finale, stubborn grace." And so the narrative concludes not with banners or verdicts, but with a tin, a spoon, and a silence that still speaks. The story of those women, of Lotte, of Marta, of all who tasted humiliation and hope in the same bite, is not easily shelved beside timelines and treaties. It lives in nuances, in the tension between scorn and salvation, in meals offered across fault lines too wide for words. History may be written by victors, but memory belongs to survivors. They did not win, nor ask to, but they endured not only because their bodies had to, but because something in them recognized grace when it arrived, however wrapped, in a can, in syrup, in the hands of an enemy boy too young to know the weight of kindness. And in that unseen offering, carried by food once mocked and now remembered, lay never just nutrition, always the chance, however faint, that before peace is declared in documents, it must first be served at table. Now the trays are gone, the camps dissolved into history, and the women who once shivered behind wire are mostly names and shadows. But in distant corners of memory, in kitchens and museums, and whispered conversations that surface without warning, the story breathes, not as condemnation or absolution, but as a question that persists. What does it mean to feed someone you're meant to hate? For those German women POWs, the answer never came neatly. It came in hunger, in confusion, in mouths full of shame and relief. It came in the unasked-for kindness of boys in foreign uniforms and the strange dignity found in a slice of canned peach. That contradiction, that unresolved ache, is the heart of what they carried home, if they made it home at all. And so, as the last witnesses drift into silence, we are left not with resolution but with a taste. A small, stubborn taste of mercy where none was owed. That's animal feed, they said, and yet how human it turned out to be. Years after the camps faded into weeds and memory, a researcher thumbing through archives in Geneva stumbled upon a bundle of correspondence marked only Field Notes, POW Welfare. Inside was a letter, its ink smudged but legible, addressed not to a person but to the ones who fed us. It read, simply, "We never saw your faces again, but we remembered the peaches, we remembered the warmth." No signature followed, just the date, July 1945. Included was a torn photo, grainy, depicting a woman mid-laugh, spoon in hand, her eyes somewhere between disbelief and relief. The researcher stared at it for a long time, wondering what could turn mockery into gratitude, what alchemy existed in a few mouthfuls of unwanted food. And, though the war was long gone, in that picture, in that letter, lived proof of something enduring. Sometimes, the smallest act, denied, dismissed, derided, becomes the very thing that survives us. And in that survival, it speaks, quietly, unforgettably, still. Perhaps that is the cruelest truth left behind, not that war starves and breaks, but that kindness, when offered in its quietest form, is what endures longest. Generals wrote their orders, borders shifted, and nations rebuilt beneath flags. But somewhere, in the silence that followed the shells and the smoke, memories of cheap meat and canned fruit bloomed into something more enduring than bitterness. It wasn't the menu itself. It was the hand that gave it. The eyes that watched without judgment, just witness. The meal that didn't ask who deserved it. That's what the women remembered. What they carried like a scar that warmed instead of burned. They remembered being seen not as enemies, or numbers, or liabilities, but as lives. Hungry, fragile, still lives. In a war bloated with cruelty, the smallest mercy became sacred. And that memory, fragile as breath on glass, does not fade. It waits. Sweet, metallic, uninvited, and unforgettable. It waits in the rustle of yellowed paper, in cellars where forgotten cans still sit beside tools and relics, in the mouths of descendants who taste sweetness and do not know why it stirs them. The war ended, but not everything it touched was buried. Those trays, those peaches, those unsought kindnesses became the quiet inheritance of a generation told to move on, yet tethered by stories whispered between sips of tea. And perhaps that is the final legacy of the so-called animal feed, that it taught not just survival, but ambiguity. That mercy can arrive unlabeled, uncooked, undeserved, and still matter more than justice. That the simplest gesture, made in the dull hours after surrender, could echo longer than any anthem. It fed them, yes, but more hauntingly it remembered them. And long after uniforms were folded away and silence resumed its reign, that memory did not ask to be heard. It simply lingered, enough to make history taste different. And perhaps that is all history can truly offer, flickers of grief and grace, caught between the fractures of violence. For the women who once laughed at rations and wept over tins, their story was never written in glory or shame alone. It was written in what they tasted, what they feared, what they unexpectedly found in the humdrum ritual of feeding and being fed. Some never spoke of it again. Others gave it shape in memoirs or heirlooms, but most simply lived with it, this strange collision of hunger and mercy nestled deep in the memory of war. The war took so much, it always does. But in rare corners, it also revealed something tender, something that held, even when everything else had fallen. A peach, a spoon, a gaze not laden with judgment but with tired, enduring humanity. These are not dramatic symbols, but they endure, softly, in silence, in taste. That's animal feed, they'd said, and yet it remembered them when the world did not. That final quiet, neither defeat nor redemption, was what endured. No statues bear their names, no hymns recall the taste of military rations, but in kitchens where daughters of prisoners now stir pots or open cans, the memory breathes, passed not as doctrine, but as inheritance, a lesson wrapped in irony, that what was once scorned saved them, that food deemed unworthy became a vessel for dignity. And perhaps that is the only truth we can hold on to, that in the bleakest chapters of human cruelty, the smallest graces flicker brightest. A spoon extended across enemy lines meant more than its weight. A tin tray held more than lunch. It held a lifeline, a fracture of light in a brutal sky. And though time has dusted over every bunk, every ration, every gloved hand offering peaches, one echo remains. They were fed. And in that brief, unsought mercy, they were seen. So the ending was never just the liberation or the transport home. It was this memory passed like a quiet blessing between generations, more felt than told. Marta's great-granddaughter, years later, would serve peaches at a family gathering without knowing why, just that it felt right. Lotte's old spoon would hang on a kitchen wall, not decorative, not explained. These remnants needed no interpretation. They were silent proofs of a time when strangers fed strangers. When war paused, not in treaties but in meals, in the strangeness of being cared for by those once feared. That was the true twist in the story. Not just survival, but the confrontation of compassion beneath defeat. It was not food alone that saved them, it was the reminder that behind uniforms and borders, someone reached out without demand. And so, that strange kindness lives on, not glorious, not loud, but enduring, in taste, in tenderness, in a spoon no one throws away. And decades later, when war became a lesson and not a memory, one classroom displayed a battered ration tin beside a journal page yellowed with time. The students, bored, glanced past it until one teacher read aloud the penciled note beneath. Fed by the enemy, saved by kindness. That sentence landed quieter than textbooks, heavier than timelines. And maybe that is all that remains when the noise of history fades. The small truths that defy the simplicity of good versus evil. In hunger, mockery became gratitude. In captivity, kindness crept in. Peaches in syrup. A spoon passed through wire. Eyes meeting for a second too long. These were not moments meant for memorials, but they endure, because some memories feed more than the body. They nourish the truth that even in a world divided by hatred, A single act of compassion can hum louder than guns ever could, and in that hush the story is still being told. Somewhere, perhaps in a drawer untouched for seasons, a child will one day find a spoon old, dull, ordinary. She may not ask where it came from, or she might, and be told only that it mattered once. She may imagine soup or porridge, never knowing it once held a peach slice that tasted like survival. But even if its story is not told, that spoon carries something rare, a silence dense with meaning. In it lives the echo of a moment when hate took pause, when hunger stripped away flags and fury and left two truths, one who needed and one who gave. That is how history holds on, not in speeches, but in objects loaded with untold weight. And as long as one such spoon remains, tucked behind photos and folded napkins, so too does the memory of a time when something dismissed as animal feed revealed the last stubborn light of human grace, quiet, fragile, remembered. And so it ends not with resolution but with reverence, a memory not etched into stone but carried in kitchens, in whispers, in a spoon's quiet weight. The women who once scoffed at rations lived to remember their shame, their hunger, their unexpected grace. They taught us that even in the darkest chapters, a simple act, a meal offered without malice, can outright the violence of an entire war. That is what endures. Not the battles or the treaties, but the mercy served when no one was watching. That's animal feed, they had declared. Yet it became a sacrament of survival, of empathy, of fragile peace. Long after the uniforms were shed and the camps forgotten, its taste lingers metallic, sweet, impossible. A mouthful of contradiction that history almost missed, but not entirely, because somewhere, someone remembers, and that is enough.